Witam wszystkich bardzo serdecznie.
So welcome everybody. My name is Rabbi Miriam Klimova from Haifa, from the Shirat Hayam congregation. So today we'll continue discussing various turning points in Jewish history based on the book of Rabbi Marc Rosenstein. And today's topic seems very fascinating to me. I know I always say that, but this time it's actually the case. So we'll be discussing a new era, and along with new times come new challenges. And this time, the challenge was the challenge of emancipation. So if we look at how Jewish life looked like in various Jewish communities around the world, we'll remember what we talked about. We talked about the golden age of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, that after Jews lived in Babylonia, they would disperse. Then they lived, among others, in Spain and under the rule of Muslims. So we remember that that's when the golden era came, the economy, the culture was developing. And something similar, comparable to that golden age, can be found also on European soil, because a similar process was taking place in the north and in the east, in the territories that then became France and Germany, in the area called Ashkenaz. And I wanted to show you the origins of the term Ashkenaz, because that's the name we use to describe the territory of France, of Germany, so Central Europe, where Jews would live. But the name itself actually stems from a couple of places in our Torah. And the first one is the book of Bereshit, of Genesis. And there we hear about the families of our forefathers. So we read about Noah and his sons and his grandsons, and that's where we see the name Ashkenaz. And that's the name we use to describe this area in Europe where Ashkenazi Jews used to live. So this covers the time of centuries that included technological development. So everything would become more and more advanced. There were more and more people. Cities and towns were expanding. So Jews would start to build communities built by local, lay, and rabbinical leaders. So if you live in Ashkenaz, you form a certain state within a state. We have our own leaders, our own rabbis, our own court. So everything is our own, but at the same time, we still fall under the local authorities, the authorities of a given state or area. And how about their professional life? Well, they would undertake various professions. For example, Rashi, one of the most famous commentators of the Torah, had actually a profession. He was a trader who was selling wine. He also produced wine. So some of the Jews in those times were quite wealthy. They were active in trade. They were merchants. They had some kind of power. So let's emphasize again that they had their own internal autonomy. So they had their institutions dealing with education, with oversight, with social welfare. So it was all their own. But again, if we compare the life of Jews in Europe and how we describe the Golden Age in the Iberian Peninsula, we see significant differences because in the Iberian Peninsula, Sephardic Jews would participate in a rich cultural life of the Muslim world. They had contacts, interactions with their philosophy, with all different areas of the society, with the authorities, and they were supporting one another. So, in our tradition, we did get some influence from those circles. Those were influences that would enrich our tradition. But we cannot say the same about Europe in the same time. So there was some stability and economic cultural expansion development on the Iberian Peninsula. But when it comes to the relations with the church between Christianity and Judaism, these were more tense. And when we say tense and we try to compare that, then generally the ideology that would say that Jews are people of an inferior status would also translate into specific requirements. For example, that they had to dress differently, to wear some specific badges. There were restrictions regarding the place where they could live. So you had Jewish streets or Jewish ghettos, or also when it comes to working as a public clerk or dealing with the law. Here in Ashkenaz Europe, you had many more restrictions. So, to sum up, Jews felt much more comfortable under the rule of the Muslims than under the law, under the rule of Christians. And besides all the reasons I already mentioned, we can also point attention to how Jews felt within the society in those times. For example, Arabic, so a Semitic language, was the official language in the Iberian Peninsula. So it was kind of in the same family as the Jewish language, whereas in other parts of Europe, you had other languages. So you had the language of Rome that would recall the bitter times of destruction and of being expelled. So Islam, just like Judaism, would not allow to bow in front of pictures, images, whereas in the Christian churches, they were full of such figures and images. And we can see that despite of all these difficulties and challenges, Jews nonetheless would stay in Ashkenaz. And among them, we have some very prominent rabbis who would influence their whole generation. We have, for example, Gershom from Mainz. He was also called Meor HaGola, so the light of the diaspora. So Rabbeinu Gershom is well known for his decrees, for example, the prohibition against polygamy. So if we open the Torah, we see a description of families in which we have many wives. Each one of our forefathers, well, with the exception of Isaac, had several wives or concubines. So our tradition would never prohibit that. But Gershom from Mainz, as he lived in a European society, he said, okay, since we are living here among Christians, well, besides financial matters, namely that it's difficult to support many wives, since we want to have good relations with our neighbors. We don't want them to look at us as some savages. We also have to introduce this prohibition and introduce monogamy. And he decreed that Jews can only have one wife each. But we are talking about Europe, so this prohibition would not spread to all of the Jewish societies that were spread all across various places. So, for example, in the 20th centuries, when Jews from Yemen made Aliyah to Israel, they would bring with them a couple of wives. So the Jewish state had to think what to do about that, since they already had many wives, because they were not covered by that prohibition. But I digress, so let's go back to our main topic. So one more famous figures, Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki. He is well known for his commentary to the Hebrew Bible, to the Tanakh, but also to the Babylonian Talmud. So he was a key commentator. No rabbis could write any of their sermons without relying on Rashi. So what was happening in Europe in those times? Well, we have to talk about the Crusaders. So we have 200 years in our story, in our history, that were really, really difficult. And they strongly shaped the Jewish society because they were such difficult times. We had at least 7 European military campaigns aimed at conquering the Holy Land. But these campaigns were accompanied with a negative approach toward Jewish communities, and this happened in each European country on European territory. So, over the course of these 200 years, thousands of Jews would be killed during massacres. Many of them were mutilated, probably especially after the First Crusade. So if life becomes so difficult, so bitter, then, as we know from our history, as we know, we always try to find a way out. So in this case, the solution, the way out was a big wave of migration. So this was from the 13th to the 16th century at least. And here we have Poland. Poland was a big land, a wealthy land, a good land, but it also required support. It needed new people, and also Jews were well educated. So we see that there weren't so many temptations or opportunities for integration. They would bring their own language with them to Poland, because Yiddish, it's not a Judeo-Polish language, it's a Judeo-German language. Yiddish is more similar to German. So when they came to Poland, they already had their own identity that had already been shaped to a larger extent in Germany. So, as they started to migrate, to some extent they were satisfied with the life that they had because they lived in closed communities. It was a closed community, self-contained, that could well manage on its own to a large extent, but the price for that was a an expensive system of restrictions, for example, special taxes on Jews, public humiliation. So a situation when there was no large, powerful institution that could defend Jews from the whims of the rulers. And then came some changes. So when we talk about emancipation, some say that, okay, we had the Renaissance, so we had the humanism of Renaissance, and that's what brought about the change. But in the opinion of Rabbi Marc, the author of our book, he says that actually the more important turning point was the 30 Years' War. So it was shaped by political, maybe even nationalistic conflicts, but it was nonetheless always described as a religious war, as the competition between Catholicism and Protestantism. So it's maybe actually the 30 Years' War that was such a shock for people that it was such a difficult experience for people in Europe that they would start to search for a different approach, a different answer to the question about what is religion, what is nationality, and what is a state. And in those times, we had this important figure, John Locke. So he was writing about the role of humans in the world and the role of human choice. So he asked the following question in his writings: is faith, belief, something that depends on someone's decision? Can I decide what I will believe in and I won't believe in? Would someone like to answer? Can humans make a decision regarding what they'll believe in? That's an interesting question. I would say yes, says Barbara. Well, to a certain extent, maybe at first, no. But then later on, as you get to know different religions, then you can choose. In my opinion, yes, because here we have many people who made a choice to join Judaism. We were not born as Jews, it was our decision. Thank you. This is a very interesting question. And it's quite an intriguing question, I must say. So, in Locke's opinion, religion, faith, or belief is not something that people can decide on. So let's say if I had to stand up, get out of here now, let's say there was an alarm in Israel, that would be my decision. But John Locke says that faith is something that we cannot control. Either I believe in something or I don't. Of course, I can learn many things, or I may not learn them. And then he writes his letter concerning toleration. It's a philosophical tractate, Epistola de Tolerantia, and he focuses on a couple of topics. For example, tolerance as a value inscribed in the gospel. For example, the need of a division, separation between the state and the church. And that's quite interesting if we actually see such a complete separation now in the 21st century. Another topic, that you shouldn't force anyone to accept any religion. So why does this interest us? Because if you ask this question, whether people can choose their faith, John Locke says no. And then he says that we cannot force anyone to convert to a different religion, that they can perform some actions, but we cannot force, let's say, a Jew to start believing in Jesus, or we cannot force a Christian to embrace Judaism, to start to believe in Judaism. That's not possible. They may carry out certain actions, activities, but we don't have control over our faith, over what we believe in. If someone would tell me I have to believe that I'm not in Haifa right now, but I'm in Warsaw, well, I wouldn't believe that. So John Locke tells us that faith is something individual, that it's so individual that individuals have no control over that. You either have it or you don't. So he tells us that the church must be a group of free people who chose it, who joined it out of their free choice willingly. So religion cannot be something that's imposed on people. So you cannot baptize anyone forcibly. So now let's move on to Jewish tradition and philosophy. So I mentioned John Locke and his letter on tolerance because this had great influence over what happened next in Jewish tradition. So our next protagonist, Moses Mendelssohn, he was a Jewish German philosopher, one of the first thinkers who was trying to define Jewish enlightenment, Haskalah. So who was he? How did he influence today's Judaism, contemporary Jewish thought? So Europe worked on emancipation for about 200 years. It was trying to define where is an individual and what's the role of church. And this had to do with Europe as a whole, not just with Judaism. Whereas here we have Judaism that must react to the events unfolding in Europe. So it must ask questions. How can halacha continue, survive without a closed community? How can we give each individual the right to choose? So that's where Mendelssohn comes in, and his life it's an answer to the events unfolding in those times. And it's all connected to emancipation. So he's a Jewish philosopher, one of the first of a long line of thinkers, leaders who would talk about enlightenment. But let's talk about his biography, about his family, his education. So he received a traditional Jewish education. So he was educated in Tanakh, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud. But then you had a turning point, namely his teacher, David Frankel, moved to Berlin. And there in Berlin, he opened a yeshiva. And as it often happens, the student moves along with his teacher. So he moved to Berlin, and then he would be absorbing more and more the tradition that's available over there. He can study everything. On the one hand, Jewish tradition. So he is a fan of the Guide of the Perplexed. He's a great fan of Jewish philosophy, but also Greek philosophy, the philosophy that was taught everywhere in those times. So he starts to study not just philosophy, but different types of sciences. He starts to learn French, English, Latin. So he wants to learn as much as possible. And then with time, he becomes one of the most prominent German philosophers, not just Jewish philosophers. And what's interesting, he's never stepped foot in an academia. He studied all of this by himself. He learned all of it by himself. Languages, philosophy, sciences. And he would also observe all the mitzvot. He identified as a Jew. And here on purpose, I'm not saying Orthodox or something else because you didn't have such divisions back then. In those times, the Jewish community was not divided into different movements. He was simply a Jew. He would observe all the commandments. He was a Jew who was fascinated with scientists. He was very well educated, had great knowledge, great potential. So let's just take a look at this image of him. What is he wearing? Does he resemble an ordinary German in those times? If we look at him, yes or no? That's a quick question. Does he look like an ordinary German? Maybe we don't know what Germans would wear back in those days. Well, maybe judging by his clothes, maybe not judging by his face, his appearance. Yes, I mean his clothes, because that tells us about his social status, about the circles that he was present in. So if we take a look at his clothes, he looks like a member of the bourgeoisie of those times. His clothes are the same as those worn by German writers. So Moses Mendelssohn is the first Jew who lived in both of these worlds simultaneously. So in the Jewish world, as I said, he was a Jew. He would observe all the commandments. So he lived a Jewish life. And at the same time, he was a member of the German society. But at the same time, he had many friends. He was talking to a famous German writer. He would ask him, "What do you think about Jesus?" And Moses would say, "Well, this is not something we believe in my religion. We don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, but I can accept that he was a teacher. I can accept that he was a teacher, that he did many good things. For example, he introduced morality, and that's great." Of course, if the Jewish community would hear that, then they would excommunicate him. And this is one of the great problems of those times. It was a great problem for Moshe Mendelssohn himself. And that's because, on the one hand, he really wanted to stay in touch with the world that surrounded him. His biography is a great example of the meeting between Jewish tradition and modern times. So Mendelssohn would say that it's possible to live in both of these worlds, that it's actually something we want. And this is what we try to do as Reformed Jews nowadays. So he believed that Jewish religious life and German identity are not contradictory, are not mutually exclusive, that in those times of emancipation, you can somehow combine all of that, and you have to embrace all of that, that Jews as a society have to develop by being open to what's happening around the world. So, in his writings, in his life, Mendelssohn gives a testimony. He shows that this is possible. As for his writings, he translated the Tanakh into German with a Hebrew commentary. He would actually write the German translation using Hebrew letters. But why is this so important? We know that, well, the Jewish community was not too happy about this translation. But what was the main goal of Mendelssohn? So he thought that this translation would help Jews to be well versed in all different areas, that they would get to know German well, that was the local language, and at the same time, it would bring them closer to the text itself, to the sources. When he was 30 years old, he asked himself, why am I not a rabbi? I'm well educated, I'm a part of the Jewish community. Why am I not a rabbi? So he wanted to become a rabbi. But several rabbis said no, they wouldn't ordain him as a rabbi. So they say, hey, listen, if you want to be a rabbi as a teacher, then that's not enough for you because you are already greater as a teacher. You are so well educated. But if you wanted to be a rabbi as a leader of the Jewish community, then we cannot agree to that. And why? Because his ideas, his thinking was too modern. He was looking too far ahead, and they wouldn't know where is this all heading. How is this going to end? Is this actually a good idea to study, learn German, and to live in both worlds? Maybe we should rather stay within our own isolated world, because if we go out to the second world, if we become part of the German society, then maybe then we'll disappear, we'll become fully assimilated. So they said, no, you cannot be a rabbi, you're 30 years old and you do not have a wife. So he got married. And people write that she was neither smart nor pretty. I don't know why they say that. Maybe that's Lashon Hara. But we know what was so unique about this family, and namely that there was love. And that's one of the things that was frowned upon in those times within the Jewish community. And why? Because it all should be decided by a sidduch, by a shidduch. The community should find the best woman for you, the one who is appropriate for you, who is of the appropriate age and who's not 32. But if we look at the letters between the both of them, we see that Mendelssohn actually loved her and he chose her himself out of love. And in those times, that was an absolute novelty. It was contrary to tradition. and a couple of interesting facts about Moshe Mendelssohn. So in 1772, a German community from the town of Schwerin wrote to Mendelssohn with a halachic question. What was the question about? So the local authorities had decreed that you cannot bury someone immediately after their death. As we know, Jewish tradition tells us we should do it on the same day as quickly as possible. So the local authorities maybe were afraid that you might have some condition when it seems that someone has died, but actually they are still alive. So just to make sure, they said you cannot bury someone right away, but just wait for a little bit, just check a couple of times if they are actually dead. And of course, the Jewish community said, no, we will not comply with that. And then Mendelssohn is looking for a halachic answer. And he says that since the halacha itself allows to delay a burial, for example, if one of the relatives has to arrive at the funeral, then we can also postpone the burial for this reason given by the local authorities. But of course, the Jewish community did not like that. So Mendelssohn was trying to understand, to reason with both sides. So, on the one hand, to explain to the Christian authorities what are the reasons for this Jewish custom, and on the other hand, he wanted to reason with the Jewish community, but well, he was not too successful at the end. And another important fact, in 1778, in Berlin, a very special educational facility was opened. So we would say it was the free school in Berlin, the Jüdische Freischule. So it was for poor children, but it was the first school in Jewish history that would provide education not just of the Jewish kind, so Torah, Talmud, and the Mishnah, but also general education. And the Jewish community was strongly opposing that. So you have a school that gives children the opportunity to learn mathematics, to learn German. So it gives them a chance to become members of their society. If they would speak German, if they would know mathematics, astronomy, and so on, then they could move out of the Jewish community and become part of the wider German society. And in 1783, Mendelssohn completes the first German translation of the book Jerusalem, where he says that you can preserve halacha and at the same time have emancipation, civic emancipation, and integrate with the modern state. So he's the first example of a Jew who lives in both worlds. He is also a thinker who says that Jews can become citizens, that they can remain Jews and at the same time be Germans or Poles. And now let's talk about the historical background. So in 1789, the French Revolution starts. In 1791, the French National Assembly grants full civic rights to all the Jews. So this was something absolutely new. So all the restrictions that we mentioned, restrictions on clothing, on profession, on work, additional taxes, all that disappears. But that's not the end. And Napoleon called an assembly, the assembly of notables, as well as a great Sanhedrin. And what was the purpose? So it's 1806, it's about 20 years after Mendelssohn's death. So Napoleon wants to consolidate his rule, and he wants to respond to the anti-Jewish policy. So he sees that there is anti-Jewish agitation in the era of emancipation. So he orders that an assembly should be called to explore the chance of integrating Jews as full-fledged citizens. So you had 122 Jewish leaders, both lay and rabbinical, and they were asked 12 questions. So, for example, can Jews have more than one wife? Let me remind you of Rabbenu Gershom, and we can say thank you, Rabbenu Gershom, for making us compatible with life in Europe. Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? Is divorce valid, although pronounced not by courts of justice, but by virtue of laws in contradiction to the French Code? And so on and so on. So each question has to do with Jewish identity and Jewish autonomy in a state, in this case, a French state. So if a Jew, as a citizen, is he supposed to comply with all their obligations or not? Another question, does Jewish law forbid the Jews to take usury from their brethren? And we have an interesting question, number 6. Do the Jews born in France and treated by the law as French citizens acknowledge France as their country? Are they bound to defend it? Are they bound to obey the laws and follow the directions of the civil code? So, on the one hand, we have these difficult questions, and they force the notables to openly confront such topics. So, the questions were not easy, their deliberations were not easy. And here, this sixth question illustrates the painful price that emancipation was connected to for the Jewish community, because they have to do to the fact that Jews pray constantly for the return to their ancestral homeland of Israel, to the homeland of their forefathers. So, what's the answer? How do you answer such questions? So here is the answer. Men who have adopted a country, who have resided in it these many generations, who even under the restraint of particular laws which abridged their civil rights, were so attached to it that they preferred being debarred from the advantages common to all other citizens rather than leave it, cannot but consider themselves as Frenchmen in France, and they consider as equally sacred and honorable the bounden duty of defending their country. So now, in this new reality, if Jews wanted to be treated equally, they were expected to declare loyalty only to their French homeland and to its laws. And then rabbis continue their answer. Jeremiah exhorts the Jews to consider Babylon as their country. So they are referring to an example from the Tanakh, although they were to remain in it only for 70 years. So that's the 6th century before Common Era, the Babylonian enslavement. He exhorts them to till the ground, to build houses, to sow, and to plant. His recommendation was so much attended to that Ezra says that when Cyrus allowed them to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, only 42,360 only they left Babylon, and that this number was mostly composed of the poor people, the wealthy having remained in that city, so in Babylon. So this is given as an example that if Jews live in a given country, they love that country. The love of the country is in the heart of Jews a sentiment so natural, so powerful, and so consonant to their religious opinions that a French Jew considers himself in England as among strangers, although he may be among Jews. And the case is the same with English Jews in France. So here we have the struggle related to one's identity. So we see that the notables chose to ignore the dilemma of having to choose state over religion. That they talk in general about the love of Jews towards their homeland. This was not entirely dishonest, because we know, starting from the Talmud itself, that we have one Jewish law, Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the kingdom is the law. So, regardless of the fact that sometimes we have our autonomy, our own courts, and so on, but if you live in a given place, Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law that all the people who live somewhere are bound by, and this law becomes our law. So the questions or the demands, I don't know how to call them, voiced by Napoleon regarding also the authority of the rabbis, because Napoleon was asking who chooses the rabbis, what kind of authority do they have. He is letting us know that, well, he doesn't really want to see rabbinic authority. So, starting from the Emancipation times, the significance of a rabbi's role has changed. So, if before the rabbi was someone who made decisions, who was the head of a court, who was the head of a court, but today, at least in liberal movements, a rabbi is rather a spiritual teacher, a spiritual leader, but they do not have authority as part of the community. So each of these turning points allows us to understand what's happening in Europe. So here we can see them in the context of general events, but it also has to do with the rights of individuals, of every Jewish individual, but not only when it comes to Jews, but all individuals at the same time. Because if we talk about the German lands between 1810 and 1812, many restrictions and special taxes imposed on Jews would disappear. They were rescinded. And when you rescind taxes, then Jews would start to move to big cities. They would move to cities like Berlin, and they are starting to engage in the general sciences, in culture, just like Mendelssohn himself. And then in 1819 in Berlin, you have the Wissenschaft des Judentums, so a society for the study of Judaism. And this combines the tradition of Jewish studying and all the Jewish sources with the modern methods back in those days. So, with modern scientific, historical, and critical methods. And this is something new. Before, they would not ask such questions. So, see, this text contradicts itself in various parts. So, maybe various parts were created in different times. So, maybe King David did not write all the Psalms. If some of them talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in the Babylonian times, so should we analyze this from a scientific point of view? So these were new questions never posed before. And as for a historical background, we see that, well, it was not one constant line. So on the one hand, we did receive certain rights, for example, in France during the revolution, but then in 1815, Napoleon falls, and many of the new laws were abolished. So the restrictions came back. But then again in 1830, the French monarchy falls again, and civic equality is restored again in France. So, for example, in Germany, everything was going well. But in 1848, the democratic revolutions in Germany fail, and many Jews leave Germany. They emigrate to America. In 1858, you have civic equality, which is legislated in England, so this is good news. 1867, civic equality is decreed in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 1870, civic equality is decreed in newly united Italy. So we see that all of Central Europe is forging ahead, is developing, and all the individuals were granted more freedom. And as it grants them more freedom, it also grants more freedom and rights to the Jewish community. Let's take a look at the map of Central Europe in those times. So we see where you had many Jews. Let me zoom in. So the gray color represents the places where you had most Jews, and these are Polish lands. Berlin is in pink. You have more pink to the right, and that means that was up to 13%. So quite a big percentage of Jews live in Europe in those times, so they experience all of those changes. So these seem to be good changes. So why do we say it was a challenge? What was the challenge of emancipation? When, first of all, because it was the end of a self-autonomous community. That the establishment of the modern state means that we no longer have a state within a state. And since we no longer have a state within a state, then we can no longer require Jews to be part of that community, because now everyone can choose what kind of Jew they want to be and how they want to live their Jewish life. And this give way to a lot of compromises, a lot of ideas, interpretations about how to view Jewish practices. And it also changes the role of the rabbi. Now they are only a teacher. They must be very charismatic for anyone to listen to them because their listeners are no longer bound to respect them. So now the rabbi becomes rather a counselor than a judge. So that's one consequence. And another turning point that there is a change in the integration of Jews into the European society. From this point on, Jews could aspire to positions of wealth and power, social status, intellectual and artistic achievement. They can be artists. They can make use of everything that's around them. They can use all of that as their inspiration. So it's no longer so strictly connected to religion or to Jewish identity. They can learn, they can create in the German society. So a whole new world is opened. And whether this is a challenge or if it's enrichment, well, everyone should decide for themselves. So we have inspiration in something other than Judaism, and as a result, many Jews choose to reduce their commitment to Jewish learning because, well, if you focus on something else, then you don't have time to study the Talmud, or they stop observing the rituals or focusing on Jewish philanthropy. They stop giving money to it because now they are open to the whole world. Or this terrible word, and we'll hear a lot of it starting from the 19th century, assimilation, that Jews no longer lived in closed communities. So, to a certain extent, they cease being Jews. But at the same time, we see a positive impact on Jewish intellectual and spiritual life, just as during the Golden Age in Spain. Here we see the same extensive contact and serious dialogue with Gentile culture gave rise to significant creativity within the Jewish community. So, too, you have new works, new writings, new interpretations. So the enlightenment that we talked about was a great source of inspiration. So we have new writings that allow us to understand what Jewish identity, what Jewish philosophy is. So we have writings related to Jewish science that employ a scientific method to analyze Jewish writings. Suddenly you have these academic commentaries and research. So Jewish culture has become open to European ideas, European culture. We see that in those times. So it's emancipation, it's a challenge, but it's also enlightenment, haskalah. That's how we call this time, this era of the development of Jewish history in our tradition, haskalah in Hebrew. So everyone who has pursued such studies was called a maskil. So we know that emancipation brought about many changes and it's changed the rules forever. So now, Each person can decide individually what they believe in, what they don't believe in. They can choose for themselves what kind of life they want to build for themselves and what they want to study. So, from now on, Jewish tradition will need to find the right format, the right formula to somehow make sure that Judaism adapts to a situation when humans now have so much freedom. And our next topic for our next meeting will be the search for an answer when the tradition starts to look for reform. Thank you very much for today's meeting. And now let's start our discussion.